It's 11 a.m. on D-Day. The confusion in the German ranks is still total. But in this hour, they begin to consolidate their information.
At the same time, the French resistance across France is picking up their activities, or at least continuing preparations to do so. When we left the Vercours plateau about 6 hours ago, the Maquis in the region were assembling their men and weapons and getting ready to put their long-held plans into action. Now those plans are in full swing and the resistance is taking the first steps to create a free French Republic. It's a series of shots in the mist created by a lack of knowledge and information. Despite repeated requests by de Gaulle, Allied command has refused to allow full information about the unfolding and upcoming events. Only a few hours ago, the men and women on Vercours didn't even know the invasion was going to happen on this day. The paratroopers they think will soon be dropping in are a figment of their imaginations, born out of hopeful interpretations of the vague information they have been given. Be that as it may, that the invasion has begun is the mother of hope and renewed energy. In the town of Crest, which sits close to the southwestern tip of the plateau, Jean Dacier feels a new wind of optimism blowing through France. He spent last night blowing up electricity pylons and believes that Hitler's Festung Europa will soon be demolished by the invading Allies. The time has come to rise up. Here's how he describes the events in the town as the clock ticks closer to midday. A little man began going round announcing that the military command in the area wished the public to know that the French Fourth Republic had been proclaimed in the town and that all citizens should remain calm. A table was set up in the main square to enable those who wished to enroll. Lots came. No formalities, no name, just a forename or an alias which people could choose for themselves, together with an oath of allegiance. That was sufficient. Similar things are happening in other towns and villages surrounding the plateau. In Bourg-de-Péage, just off the west edge, locals cheer as lorries adorned with French tricolores carry volunteer fighters up to the plateau. In Sassange and Die, newly formed groups of Maquis have taken it upon themselves to guard the northern and southern entry points to the plateau, respectively. In Grenoble, the largest city in the region, French flags flutter from buildings and neighbors hold small street parties. But the joy is cut through with apprehension. Everyone knows that the Germans will not allow this insubordination to continue. So in Crest, Grenoble, and up on the plateau, preparations are being made for battle. Sentries are posted on the roads, defensive positions constructed, caches of weapons and ammunition are opened up and distributed. Up on the plateau itself, the military commander, Chef d'Escadron François Huet, is setting up his headquarters in the Hôtel Breton. All through the morning and into the afternoon, volunteers continue heading up the massive rocky outcrop where they will make their stand. The writer and journalist Paul Dreyfus describes the atmosphere. From these towns, the Vercours was seen as a fantastic citadel encircled above the dark wall of pines by a white ring of limestone cliffs. The young had made 1,000 visits there, walking and climbing. The older ones had hunted hares and grouse. One way or the other, they all knew the footpaths of this grim, powerful massif. In those intoxicating hours, it seemed impregnable. But how impenetrable is it really? Can they hold out without the paratroopers, who most definitely are not about to land here or anywhere close anytime soon?
Well, paratroopers are definitely not coming to their aid today, but it looks like the Germans might be coming. Last hour, they began discussing the enactment of an order codenamed Tannenbaum, not to be confused with the unrealized Nazi plans to invade Switzerland and Liechtenstein by the same name.
This Tannenbaum refers to an anti-partisan sweep with mass arrests, the deployment of the Wehrmacht to fight the Maquis, and reprisals against civilians to deter the French population from joining the fight. Essentially, it instructs commanding officers to commit war crimes. Shortly after 10 a.m., Aubé-Vest received the first report of major sabotage. The bridge over the Dordogne at La Chapelle de Mareuil had been blown up. Rundstedt's chief of intelligence and propaganda, Wilhelm Meyer-Dettring, immediately recommended enacting Tannenbaum in Normandy and areas where sabotage occurred.
Other parts of Rundstedt's staff inquired about the general situation among civilians and received reports that things were calm and orderly for the most part. Still, at 11:07, Rundstedt orders that Tannenbaum shall now be in effect, but only in the area directly or indirectly affected by the fight.
Meanwhile, reports come in that in Belgium, the armed resistance of the White Brigade are about to attack and occupy Antwerp. This is a wild exaggeration, but Rundstedt decides to deploy 2 battalions of the 84th Armée Corps to protect Antwerp. For that, they request fuel, but get no answer. In 2 hours, they will be told that there is no fuel, and they will have to go by train.
Okay, these troops are not near the battlefield, but they might very well be needed here soon, if not already now. More and more reports are coming in about the defenses crumbling on the coast, but at the same time, false reports keep also rolling in, sending units east of the Orne by way of the routes south of Caen to the west and south of Lisieux to the east. Now, any units deployed there will be cut off from easy access to the battlefield, since the British hold the bridges at Bénouville. They can also not be reinforced from the east, since the bridges over the Dives River have been blown.
To paraphrase Hitler's words from last hour in reverse, now the Allies finally have the Germans where they can beat them. In Germany, the Nazi newsmakers seem unaware of the irony between reality and Hitler's attitude. By now, the reports reaching news networks are substantial enough for expert analysis by military correspondents, pundits, and strategists. The assessment they make is of good progress and that the massive force has achieved surprise. One of the reports they base their analysis on is Richard Hotlet's account that we heard a few hours ago and is broadcast for the first time in this hour. Another pool report confirming this follows right after.
This is David Anderson speaking from London. There's no doubt in my mind that Hitler was literally caught with his pants down by the Allied landing on the north coast of France. I was able to gain substantiation for this opinion while working together with a wing of an RAF Tactical Air Force somewhere in England up to a few hours ago. For some time after H hour, there was practically no sign of German army transport on any of the roads in the whole of the invasion area.
He reports on the activities on the airfield he's been at since early morning and then returns to the effect of surprise.
I was waiting in the briefing room once again as the first pilots reported. Their task had been to hunt out and shoot up or bomb any German transport on the roads on the French coast. From the very beginning, it was hoped that none would be seen. This would be a definite indication that the Hun didn't know where we were going to land. And as the boys came back, one by one, this hope was realized. Except for a few scattered cars on the road, nothing was seen. Most of the pilots saw no transport whatsoever, so they concentrated on bombing road junctions and railways. The Germans were caught napping.
As we know, the assessment is correct. But it's not just the German armed forces that have been caught off guard. So has their public relations departments. Yes, plural. Within Hitler's tradition of ruling by division and pitting his minions against each other, he has groomed 2 leaders for public relations. On the one hand, Reichspropaganda-Minister Joseph Goebbels, and on the other, Reichspressechef Otto Dietrich. In theory, Dietrich's department that organizes messaging for the entire Nazi-controlled press is in Goebbels' resort. In practice, Hitler has granted Dietrich great autonomy and made sure that both men report to him personally. Both of them are constantly bickering and complaining about the other, and often release competing, even contradictory messaging. The worst case to date was when in October 1941, Dietrich, in a fervor of Nazi enthusiasm, announced and published German victory in Russia, and then the Battle of Moscow brought Operation Barbarossa to a grinding halt. Goebbels has never forgiven him for that, while Hitler quickly forgave him and keeps him close to his side, giving Dietrich major influence on the Führer's speeches and public addresses. Today, both Goebbels and Dietrich are in Berchtesgaden. Goebbels is with Hitler's private secretary and Reichsleiter Martin Bormann, and Dietrich is at the Berghof, Hitler's alpine home. In both places, a response is being worked on. In Goebbels and Hitler's minds, the basis will be what the Nazis have been communicating with increasing urgency, that they are more than ready and will beat the Allied invasion back. Head of the OKW, the Chief of the Operations Staff of the Armed Forces High Command, Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, has announced that he looks forward to the battle with full confidence. And only 2 days ago, Goebbels spoke in front of 70,000 people in Nuremberg, stating that, "When the enemy comes, we will teach them a lesson." The next day, he went to Berchtesgaden and met Hitler. He noted in his diary that the Führer looked splendid and was in good spirits. According to Goebbels, the surrender of Rome the day before had in no way left Hitler depressed. While warnings that the invasion might be that same night reached them, Goebbels, Hitler, and Eva Braun sat together and reminisced in front of the open fireplace, and I quote Goebbels, "It was the same mood as back in the good old days." After he got the news that the invasion had come a few hours ago, he noted, "With that, the day that will decide the war has then begun." The communication coming from the front at this point isn't quite that upbeat as the confident leadership imagines, though. And in Berlin, Dietrich's staff are struggling to formulate a response. They hold a daily strategy briefing at 11:30 a.m. to decide what the Tagesparole, the daily headlines, are going to be for the Nazi-controlled press. The conference is usually at 11:30 a.m., but today a long string of phone calls and meetings segue into the conference shortly after 11 a.m. Dietrich joins the disjointed discussions by phone at 11:30 and sets the record straight. The Führer wants the message to be that the Allies will be beaten back into the sea. They also aim to frame, or perhaps even believe, that the invasion has been orchestrated through puppeteering by Joseph Stalin and the Bolsheviks. Thus, they make it an integral part of the war the Nazis claim to be fighting against their delusions about a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. As we have seen, this is also the propaganda message that has been fed in endless streams to the German-led soldiers now fighting and dying in Normandy in a mortal fantasy of defending a united Europe. So the message and framework they prepare for the press briefing to take place sometime in the next hour is in essence no news, just more of the same old propaganda. In Berchtesgaden, Dietrich formulates Hitler's personal message to the German troops. "Soldiers on the Western Front, the enemy has begun the attack on Europe that we have long awaited. Their intent is clear to all of us. You are now called upon to thwart them and thereby safeguard the national security and the existence and future of our folk."
Okay, while not as far off as the overly upbeat assertion by Hitler, the hopes of the world for a swift end to the war are by no means near fulfillment at this point. In fact, despite that Sparty is right about the Allies having the Germans pretty much where they want them, the fighting is far from over, and there has not been a decisive victory anywhere.
True. Especially when you consider the German units going in the wrong way right now will sooner or later realize their mistake, and even without them, the battle is fierce.
One of the strongest airborne enclaves on the Cotentin Peninsula is Saint-Mère-Église. Colonel Krause's American flag, which signaled the capture of Naples last year, proudly flies over the old Norman roofs. Although the 505th holds a strong grip on their perimeter, though, there are constant reports of German patrols creeping around the outskirts. The fear of snipers is high, especially with so many high-ranking officers of the 82nd in and around the town. Benjamin van der Voort, with his broken ankle, is trying his best to coordinate the defensive efforts. We always called him Ben, never Colonel. He'd give you a rap on the head if you saluted him in combat. I was the same way. I told my men, never salute me, because that gives away to the enemy who the officers are, and then you get picked off by snipers. That's what we did with the Germans. Once you knock their officers and non-coms off, the privates, hell, they didn't know what to do. We could improvise a lot quicker than they could. The German garrison had been overwhelmed by Colonel Krause's group in one fell swoop into the town center. They have also cut the main communications cable to Cherbourg. So, for the time being, Van der Voort has ordered his men to dig in, build roadblocks, and prepare for the eventual German counterattack. And most importantly, to cut down all the Americans that are still hanging dead from their chutes in the trees, buildings, and telephone lines in and around Sainte-Mère-Église. McNeely's 2nd Battalion, 8th Regiment makes its probing attack on Poupéville. Leaving the causeway, they can see that the bridges are still intact and have not been blown by the Germans. A good sign, for sure, yet shortly after that, they spot several armed men in field gray uniforms running around the outskirts of the village, accompanied by the sound of distinctly American rifle shots. Poupéville is still hot, with the paratroopers controlling the center, but not everywhere, even after all these hours. But now, with the spearhead of the 8th Infantry appearing on the other side, and now also backed by a few tanks, the boxed-in enemy quickly surrenders. And raising orange flags, the U.S. Army and the U.S. Airborne meet each other for the first time in this sector. This actually happens just around 11 a.m. as this hour begins. I pulled out my square of orange cloth, which identified us as allies, and hoisted it on a stick. A few more rifle bullets crackled around, but then an orange flag waved back and forth from beyond the bridge. An airborne soldier, Lieutenant Luther Knowlton of the 3rd Battalion, 501st Parachute Infantry, jumped over a hedgerow and greeted me as if he had not seen an American in years. Pretty much the same thing happens at the western terminus of Causeway 3 to the northwest at Andouville-la-Hubert. The 1st Battalion of the 8th Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Conrad Simmons, heads across the narrow roads and encounters several small groups of German soldiers. These, at the sight of Sherman tanks, throw down their arms or run away. Pursuit is, however, hindered not just by the flooded landscape, but also the after effects of the heavy bombardment by the 9th Air Force, which cratered the whole area. It is not until they reach Andouville that the enemy is finally caught in between the advancing 8th Infantry and the paratroopers of the 502nd and surrenders in large groups. The Americans are surprised by the large numbers of Poles, Czechs, and Georgians they take prisoner. Coming in hot under heavy mortar fire, the first wave of Colonel Eugene Slappy's 115th hits the beaches at 11. The tide is high, so there's only about 30 meters to reach the shingle, but there are still casualties. The 1st and 2nd Battalions begin moving into the gaps in the wire provided by the 16th Infantry. Immediately, they go over the shingle and up the bluffs, encountering only narrow paths that channel their ascent into long, snake-like columns. While the men slowly climb up the bluffs, Colonel Slappy meets with General Wyman and receives orders to attack the village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer itself. In concert with the 2nd Battalion of the 18th Infantry, the 115th turns sharply to their right and makes their way cross-country through heavily mined territory. They were actually supposed to head in much later on, but Charlie Gerhard decided to commit them not that long after H hour when the first wave was being savaged. But it still takes more than 3 hours to assemble the whole regiment, get them into LCs, and then cross 20 kilometers of water before they can land. But now they land on Easy Red between Saint-Laurent and Colleville draws. This is actually 1st Division territory, but what the heck. More and more Germans are now coming down the bluffs, their hands over their heads. Many prisoners are part of the 916th Regiment from the 352nd Division. Allied intelligence said this division was supposed to be more than 80 kilometers south of Omaha Beach, though. That had been totally missed by Intel, another failure, who thought only the inferior 726 Grenadier Regiment of the 716th Division would be the main opponent here. There's a bit of hype about the 352nd, though, that needs to be brought back to earth. Many historians have incorrectly stated that the 352nd was a crack unit with a strength of 13,000. In fact, it was formed only in September 1943 from divisions which had been decimated on the Eastern Front and arrived in December. It was, in the affectionate words of one of its own officers, Lieutenant Hans Heinze, a thrown-together mob. The division may have included veterans, although most of its recruits were born between 1924 and 1926, but was not itself an experienced formation. Its chief of staff noted that 50% of the 333 officers lacked combat experience. There was a 30% shortfall in NCOs, while the 6,800 infantrymen were responsible for defending a 33-mile-long by 15-deep divisional front. It possessed more impounded French bicycles than motor transport. But still, Allied intelligence did not spot that instead of a unit of like 800 men waiting at Omaha, the enemy has nearly 3 times that. The fact that men of the 352nd are here today has often been attributed over the years, breaking the timeline, to them just happening to be here on this very day for anti-invasion maneuvers. But apparently this is a myth, which has grown to explain the failure of Allied intelligence about them. In general, though, the advance of the Americans up the bluffs in force does spell the beginning of the end of the battle for the beach. The Germans fought well in keeping the Americans on the beach, but now the chinks in their armor begin quickly collapsing their defenses. Under General Coda, Company C of the 116th has ascended the bluffs between Vierville and Saint-Laurent as well, and what presents itself to them beyond the dunes is miles of open pasture land intersected by narrow dirt roads and the unmistakable hedgerows, the bocage. One of these narrow roads leads towards Vierville, which Coda wants to take head on. Easier said than done. The burst of a concealed German machine gun cuts down a row of his men before they can find cover among the hedges and ditches. As we've seen elsewhere, bocage fighting is very different to the straight approach at the beach. Even small enemy groups, heck, even one man hidden in the thick foliage along the heavily mined roads can inflict massive casualties. Coda had seen the column stop west of Vierville and was on his way to see what the delay was. They told him that the bodies in the ditch had been hit and killed by sniper fire, described Morse, but Coda stood there with his .45 still in his hand. He told us we had to get something off the road to maneuver against the source of the enemy fire that was holding us up. It was at this point that the typical Normandy hedgerow first presented itself as a problem. The enemy guns were evidently well camouflaged, and the riflemen found it impossible to determine an enemy location by muzzle blast or smoke. The Germans were using smokeless powder. With that in mind, Coda's group begins moving very slowly and methodically towards Vierville. When they enter the outskirts, there are the typical Norman houses and the narrow main street, but there are no signs of the Germans. Only a bunch of flies buzzing around a couple dead horses and the remnants of a German supply wagon. Slowly, Coda's men enter the village, behind which the critical junction of the coastal highway lies. But the enemy is not here. It is only the villagers who witnessed the liberation of Vierville. Finally, the first tidbits of good news begin trickling up from Omaha Beach to High Command. One message reads, "Men advancing upslope behind Easy Red. Men believed hours on Skyline Easy Fox. House at exit E3 silent. Destroyer shelling Le Moulin. Things look better." The notion that things look better is indeed the truth. Omaha has shown, however, how much the Germans could have achieved if Festung Europa had truly existed. Even in this state, if the defenders had held onto their strongpoints for, say, another day, had had enough ammo and supplies, and had been reinforced in time, the Americans might well have been forced to abandon Omaha. But with a constant stream of American reinforcements and the bluffs and draws being secured, the German 352nd Division is doomed to defeat. Well, if they aren't reinforced by panzers anytime soon. That's unlikely, but it could happen as long as the Germans still hold on to the coastal highway. Controlling the exits that way, they could buy themselves time and still become a massive headache for any American operations. As for the Rangers under Colonel Schneider, they're focused on getting to Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers' primary mission before everything went haywire, not Vierville. He wants to link up with Rudder and his men ASAP. The lack of communications has him fearing the worst, and Schneider is certain that Rudder is in dire need of help, so the Rangers want to bypass Vierville and head straight to Pointe du Hoc. The Germans have other ideas. Pushing through on the highway to Pointe du Hoc, The point was half a mile beyond Virville at noon. Here, the enemy had prepared positions on the side of the road and fired on the main body after the scouts had gone past. Up the road from Virville, alone and smoking a cigar, came General Coda, whom the Rangers had last seen at the top of the bluff when the Rangers were reorganizing. The general asked what was holding them up. "Snipers," said Pepper. "Snipers? There aren't any snipers here." A shot came close to the general. "Well, maybe there are," and he walked off. Virville, although liberated, is still just one small enclave in a very large countryside that is under enemy control. Nonetheless, it is a first step to getting American boots firmly set on French soil beyond the beaches. But the enemy is onto them. The 116th tries to push onwards, but they are quickly repulsed by German forces fortified in some stone buildings at the highway junction. German troops are also probing their perimeter, and sniper fire increases. Schneider's Rangers, who want to bypass the village and head for Pointe du Hoc, now find themselves drawn into its defense. New orders are flooding in. Virville, being so close to the crucial junction, must be held at all costs. Even the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc are expendable for this. Throughout the rest of the day, there will be heavy fighting around the pastures of Virville. Meanwhile, a new unit has joined the fighting beyond Omaha. The 115th Infantry's 3 battalions are by now advancing over the bluffs. They plan to secure Saint-Laurent village. This, however, is not as easy as getting into Virville is. Here the Germans are well aware they are about to be surrounded and trapped. To keep the road open, they resist fiercely, and the battle for Saint-Laurent will go on for hours. With a clear field of fire, the German machine guns and mortars have already repulsed an attempt of the 3rd Battalion of the 116th with heavy casualties. So now, the commanders of the 115th toy with the idea of simply bypassing the village's thick stone buildings. However, there is also Widerstands Nest 69 just west of it, and here, the Germans have positioned 40 rocket launchers, the Nebelwerfer. They are largely immobile, sure, and their fire is inaccurate, true, but if these screeching rockets ever get to hit the clustered men on the beaches, there will be mass slaughter. It is clear that the position must be eliminated. Like a lighthouse, the loud screams and smoky discharges attract every American unit in the vicinity, and soon there are several battalions engaged with taking out the position. As I've said, the pre-invasion bombardment at Omaha was not at all effective. Heavy cloud cover sabotaged the aerial attacks. There were 448 liberators that were supposed to do the bombing, but 117 of those arrived home, still with their bombs, since they didn't want to take the chance they'd accidentally bomb the assault waves. The rest ended up attacking woodland, fields, and French dairy herds a couple miles inland. Post-invasion analysis only identified 3 positive bomb craters near the beach, one at the rear of WN-62, and none inflicting damage. At 11:40, Walter Korfes, commanding the German 726th Grenadier Regiment, gets a message that there are holes in the lines at Omaha and it might be in danger of falling apart. But his guys are tied down in their bunkers, so any counterattack will have to be made by reserves, and that would be Kreis's 352nd Division. He has been moving his reserves around this morning. First, from near Bayeux, he sent a 3-battalion Kampfgruppe before dawn to help contain the airborne landings, and then a bit before 8 a.m., he ordered one of those battalions to head back east to try and hold near Colleville. But that's bicycle troops, and they take until around noon even just to get there. And when they do, they're outnumbered and outgunned by the 16th and 18th regiments. And he's made what seems to be a real error, based on reports from earlier that the Americans were beaten at Virville, and sent the other 2 battalions of the Kampfgruppe all the way over toward Gold Beach. But his error, or any confusion, are kind of understandable. Throughout the morning, Kreis had received reports that various strongpoints had fallen to the Americans, to learn moments later that in fact they had not been lost. Their communications had simply been cut. He was completely unaware of the penetrations around Virville by the 116th. By late morning, Kreis concluded that the Allied plan was a 2-pronged attack on Bayeux, with one arm of the assault emanating out of the Saint Laurent-Colleville area and the other out of the British sector. In fact, Kreis soon thinks Omaha Beach is under control. At 1:35, he will tell 84th Corps that the invaders have been pushed back into the sea except for at Colville, but he's counterattacking there. The conference of the bigwigs, Gale, Kindersley, Poet, and Pine Coffin, has finished. And by now, they've told Major Howard that one of his platoons has to go into Bénouville to support Nigel Taylor's 7th Battalion A Company there. Howard sends No. 1 Platoon under Joe Kane, but also sends Sweeney's 23rd Platoon and Fox's 17th Platoon to the west of Bénouville Bridge, across from the Gondres Cafe, to set up for a counterattack in case the Germans break through. They don't like this assignment, since they've been holding the bridge since the very beginning, and much of 7th Battalion has only just arrived, but they do as ordered. And here is a little anecdote about that from Stephen Ambrose's Pegasus Bridge. Okay, Sweeney is known in the British Army as Todd, right? That's how I first mentioned him hours ago, though he's actually Henry. All men called Sweeney are nicknamed Todd in the Army because of Sweeney Todd, the fictional barber and murderer from the 19th century Penny Dreadfuls and 20th century plays, songs, and musicals, right? Well, all men in the Army named Todd are nicknamed Sweeney for the same reason. Henry Sweeney met Richard Todd last week, and they had a laugh about their nicknames being each other's names. And when they parted, Todd said, "See you on D-Day." Well, now, Sweeney is low down in a hedge, right? And Todd suddenly sticks his face through and says, "I said I'd see you on D-Day," and disappears again. Todd is with A Company. It turns out to be a good thing No. 1 Platoon was sent over, since those guys come in pretty handy helping A Company clear the Germans out of some of the buildings they've captured. By 10:30 a.m., the British Second Army had landed 15 infantry battalions, 7 commandos, 7 tank regiments, 2 engineer assault regiments, 9 field artillery regiments, and detachments of scores of supporting units. There had been setbacks, local failures, severe casualties to certain units, poor performance by some specialist equipment, yet overall, the plan had succeeded stunningly well. Almost everywhere along the British line, the German coastal positions had been rolled up. It now remained to press forward, to complete the second phase of the D-Day operation, to exploit German shock and surprise, ruthlessly to seize the vital ground inland. Well, in general, sure, but this hour, there is still fighting at Gold Beach. In fact, the 1st Hams and 2nd Devons are engaged in serious street fighting at Les Hamel. Still, at 11:15, the follow-up brigades, the 56th and 151st, begin assembling on the beaches. Well, according to the after-action report, other sources say they don't start landing until noon. They are still under enemy fire, but nothing like a few hours ago. Les Hamel has still obviously not been silenced though, so 56th Brigade, who are supposed to land behind 231st at Jig, hit the ground further to the east. 151st touches down on King as planned behind 69th. By this time also, the 24th Lancers have joined 4th 7th Dragoon Guards and the Sherwood Rangers, so 8th Armored Brigade landings are now complete. And also, by noon, La Riviera is finally fully in the hands of the East Yorks. They lose 6 officers and 84 other ranks taking it, and take 45 prisoners. Meanwhile, the Green Howards have overcome the defenses on Mauvain Ridge, and as the hour ends, Doug Graham sets up 50th Divisional Tactical Headquarters there. The 6 Green Howards are heading for Crépon. 1 platoon bypasses it to attack WN-32 at La Marefontaine, which has 400mm guns. This position, however, surrenders without a fight, while the rest mop up at Crépon. At 11:15, WN-27 atop the seawall is finally knocked out. B Company from North Shore Brunswick Regiment has helped doing this from 2 DDs and an AVRE. The AVRE has been using its petard to throw explosive charges at the position until they finally blast the infantry inside of it. Saint-Auban falls. As for 48 Marine Commando, now that they have cleared Saint-Auban, they can head towards Langrune and WN-26 and then meet the British. Spoiler, They do not manage to achieve part 1 of that today. The enemy position at Langrun is a row of fortified houses along the seafront, connected internally and with a trench system surrounding it. The roads at each end of it are blocked with a 2-meter concrete wall. The inland side of the position is blocked with a minefield. There are also machine guns at every possible approach. And on the seaward side, sticking out from the promenade, are 2 concrete positions, one with a 75mm gun, the other with a 50mm anti-tank gun. The Marines are lightly armed, so they can't overcome this little fortress. 2 Royal Marine Centaur tanks will come to their aid, but the first is knocked out by mines, and the second just isn't powerful enough to do much damage to all of that concrete. By noon, Mike and Nan beaches have linked up and form a continuous front along the north of Korsul town. WN-30 is flanked and taken. The houses are all soon cleared, and over the next couple hours, the attackers are clear of the built-up areas of town and heading south toward Revière. Looking back a few hours, 92 armored vehicles landed on Sword Beach back around H hour, and more than half of those are no longer in action thanks to mines, enemy guns, and the rising tide. This also affected the landing craft. They too have a huge attrition rate. All of 185th Infantry Brigade has landed by the late morning, as well as 2 of the 3 regiments from the 27th Armored Brigade. A lot of those guys, though, are still stuck on the beach in the massive traffic jam that seems to be in no danger of being cleared up anytime soon. K.P. Smith, commanding the 185th, gives the order anyway for the 2nd King's Shropshire Light Infantry, KSLI, to start moving, even without the armor of the Staffordshire Yeomanry. He, at least, wants to head for Caen, and hopefully the armor can catch up later. So they're on foot, but they at least have some support in the form of 7th Field Regiment's self-propelled guns. Smith has a specific overall plan for the 185th Brigade, and not one of his own making. It was conceived by 21st Army Group planners and given to Miles Dempsey, and then down to Honest John Crocker, and then down to Tom Rennie, and then Smith. His tasks this day, ideally, are to assemble his 3 battalions, 2nd KSLI, 1st Norfolks, and 2nd Warwickshires, at Hermanville at 11 o'clock, get together with the Staffordshire Yeomanry Army and the self-propelled guns of the 7th Field Regiment, and then take Caen. Okay, more specifically, send the armor with the KSLI riding on it through Colville and Le Bisset, northwest of Caen, towards the city, with the other 2 battalions on foot on the flanks, mopping up the enemy. It seemed to have been dreamt up without reference to weather, terrain, or the Germans, and at least one historian has drawn attention to the fact that once Montgomery had put his master plan in place, he showed remarkably little interest in the details of making it work. However, it couldn't work. Smith is pretty aware of the obstacles that need to be overcome to accomplish the plan, particularly the 21st Panzer Division, and the possibility that it could cut off and isolate his brigade from the beach. He has ordered his men to advance, though, with or without their armored support having arrived from the congestion of the beaches. As for the 8th Infantry Brigade, the assault brigade a few hours ago, B Company of the 1st Suffolks hits WN-16, or the Morris strong point. They're expecting this to be fairly tough, but even as they approach, and before they can attack, they see white flags flying. See, they were hit hard by the naval bombardment this morning, and they're still pretty shell-shocked. They give up without a shot fired. They are, as it turns out, mostly Poles. The Poles were, in any case, only reluctantly wearing Wehrmacht field gray. As B Company roamed Morris looking for souvenirs, Company Commander Gardner watched his colleagues looting French food and wine from its cookhouse, playing with German banknotes from a payroll they had liberated, and sporting Luger pistols tucked into their belts.
Now, these Poles are not volunteers fighting for Germany. They are Polish citizens of German language ethnicity who were conscripted when the Nazis changed their citizenship to German by decree after occupying Poland in 1939. While some of these Volksdeutsche were supportive of the Nazis, the majority, about 60%, were not at all happy about the change. Despite their native language, they still identified as Poles. By spring 1940, the Nazis were disappointed with the amount of registration registration that was far under the numbers from the most recent Polish census. So, they made failure to register by Volksdeutsche a criminal offense under penalty of concentration camp. They were especially diligent in searching out men of conscription age, even incarcerating family members until the young men registered. So their unwillingness to fight is not very astonishing.
The same cannot be said for the Reich Germans, those from Germany and Austria, and the volunteers from a variety of European countries fighting for the Germans today. They are highly motivated, unwilling to surrender, and fighting as if their existence depends on it. For some of the Osttruppen, the troops from the Soviet Union, this might be because they fear the retribution from their own country that will certainly come if they are captured, even if some of them are POWs who are forced to choose between volunteering or languishing and possibly dying in a concentration camp. But the big majority of Germans and volunteers have other motivations to fight, and they are very motivated indeed.
Yes, first of all, they have been fed an endless parade of propaganda, and they are fully convinced that they and the Nazi Party are fighting a defensive war for a united modern Europe. Second of all, the threat they perceive is from British imperialism, Bolshevik communism, and a Jewish financial cabal that controls both of these and American industrialism. They believe that this imaginary cabal is out to destroy the imaginary German race and what they perceive as European Christian culture. Now, I separate that from the propaganda-induced United Europe idea because they have different origins. The latter is a widespread anti-Semitic idea that in 1944 exists far outside the Nazi Reich. All the Nazis have done is to boost it into an existential threat that warrants a total war. It is a statistical certainty that there are men fighting today in Normandy on the Allied side who believe some version of the same myth. In a survey in 1939, a majority of Americans believed that the world finances were under Jewish control to some degree, and 41% believed something had to be done about this Jewish problem. The idea that Judaism and Bolshevism is somehow connected is also widespread. Heck, even Churchill believes that there is a connection. According to their own later accounts, to many of the Germans fighting today, it is an enigma that the US and Great Britain can be so naive as to help this imaginary Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy to destroy Europe and threaten the German folk.
Although it is a complete delusion, it is without doubt an existential fear that leaves them highly motivated to fight fiercely and, if need be, to the death today. But there are two more motivators. The first, one that many captured German soldiers will recount, is they are convinced that capture will mean execution, or murder, if you like. That is not uncommon among soldiers in all wars, but here it is reinforced by the Germans knowing what their own forces have done time and time again in this war. We'll get back to how realistic, or rather unrealistic, that belief is later today. The final motivating factor for the German soldiers is fury. In their post-war interrogations and accounts, almost all of them will tell of their own and their comrades' wish to avenge their fellow civilian countrymen, family members, and friends who have been killed by the Allied strategic bombing, which is the exact reverse intended effect of that bombing, since it was meant to break Germany's morale, not boost it. Today, though, they themselves face those bombs. And not only from the ineffective, often off-target strategic bombing by heavy bombers, but from very precise and very deadly tactical bombing by fighters and fighter bombers as the Allies control the skies.
The RAF and USAAF fighter and fighter bomber squadrons have a triple mission today: protect the aerial, naval, and ground forces from the Luftwaffe, attack enemy targets on the ground to soften defenses, interdict movement, and protect the Allied ground forces. Perform reconnaissance in the process. As we saw earlier, the first mission turns out to be far easier than expected, as the Luftwaffe have for the most part already been eliminated from the battle. The order for that eventuality is to proceed to pursuing targets of opportunity as part of Package 2 of the mission envelope. In total, the Allies have 5,409 fighters and fighter bombers at their disposal. While only a portion of them will be deployed today, it means that even if the Luftwaffe would put up a hard fight, it is virtually impossible for them to deplete the Allied forces. The USAAF fighters are the P-51D Mustang, P-61 Black Widow, and P-47D Thunderbolt. The Commonwealth fighters are the Spitfire Mark IX, Hurricane Mark IIB, Tempest Mark V, and the Typhoon. The U.S. fighter bomber in use is the P-38 Lightning, while the Commonwealth fly the Mosquito B-4 Series II. Indy will have given you an overview of some of the fighters and the Lightning. I'll add a couple of words about the Mosquito. It's a monocoque construction with double-layered stress skin made out of thin birch ply, laminated spruce, and cemented balsa strips, mounted to a light metal strutwork. So a wooden plane, if you like, although the wooden fibers and fabric are saturated in glue, making it more accurate to call her a single-winged synthetic composite airframe. Her lightweight to size ratio and 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines gives her speed and performance to outrun pursuers and enemy anti-aircraft installations, and the range to reach targets far beyond most other planes of her time. Her armament and equipment are variable, making her a true multi-role aircraft, suitable for fighting, reconnaissance, and tactical bombing. And yes, I'm a fan. It's in fact easy to marvel at the technical achievement for all the Allied planes flying today. And the new shiny and advanced technology has a significant morale effect on the battlefield, on both sides. Or, as German pilot Lieutenant Thomas Baike puts it, when you saw the American planes, it was obvious that they were new from the factory. Just before the invasion, I saw inside one American plane, a Mustang, which crash-landed in a field near the coast. That plane was completely new, without even scratches on its canopy. All the pedals in the cockpit were unmarked, and our planes creaked and let in rainwater. But you mustn't think I'm complaining. I'm just telling you what I experienced. By the way, I spoke to the American pilot of that Mustang before he was taken away in my very poor English, and I told him he was a lucky bastard to have such a fine plane. Time and time again, German eyewitness accounts remark on how shiny the Allied planes are. The Thunderbolt aircraft came down on us repeatedly. I think there were 6 or 8 waves of them. Each time these very shiny planes flew low, flipped their wing to release their bomb load, and the projectiles would race towards us, bouncing across the ground and scattering around our position. It contributes to growing feelings of imminent defeat among the German forces. Well, even those of us who believed that the Allies could be thrown out of France fell silent when we saw the way the Americans were organized and the resources they had to work with. Their planes were constantly in the sky. Everything was mechanized. All supplies were carried by truck or train, with seemingly no concern over the amount of fuel used. If a jeep or a truck broke down, it was neglected rather than repaired, and a fresh one was used, still shiny from the factory. Instead of using local food, they ate from tins and cans of food that were made in America. We found this fascinating, and we formed an impression of an unstoppable power that would simply roll over any obstacle. And to destroy these obstacles, to pave way for the roll of force, is the task that the Allied fighters and fighter bombers go after today. As you may have noted, the German infantryman just spoke of Thunderbolt, a fighter, not a fighter-bomber, bombing them. He's not mistaken. Many of the fighters carry single or double bombs or 2 rockets into battle today. It's part of the multi-package mission envelope, providing the ability to strike by both bombing and strafing. The bombs and rockets they carry are either impact explosive bombs or incendiary. The incendiary bombs and rockets are napalm and or white phosphorus devices. So in swarm after swarm, the Allied fighters come in over the battle zone. In effect, they lay a huge net over France and the English Channel all the way from the North Atlantic to the North Sea. Over France, inside a semicircle with a circumference of 200 kilometers, from the landing zones to the northernmost tip of Bretagne in the west, to Angers in the south, and the Somme estuary in the east, any Luftwaffe activity is to be repressed and all airfields bombed. In a line from Saint-Brieuc on the coast in Bretagne, southeastward to Rennes, eastward through Laval and Dreux, and then northward back out to the coast along the Seine River, They are to attack fortified positions, military installations, and any troop movements. These operations start in the morning, parallel to the landings, and continue throughout the day. Pilots will fly multiple sorties this day, returning only briefly to their airfields in England to refuel and rearm. For the German defenders, it means that wherever they go, they are at risk of being hounded and attacked by Allied planes. With the Luftwaffe crippled, the Allies have complete control of the skies. In difference to the strategical bombings, these attacks are murderously effective. The squadrons come in low, search out their targets, and unload a barrage of explosions, fire, and bullets. To understand in which way this harrows the German defenders, let's follow Stefan Heinewitz, a German Gefreiter or private. He tells his story in the highly recommended 2-volume book D-Day Through German Eyes, a series of eyewitness accounts recorded by German journalist Dieter Eckarts in 1954 and compiled into a book form by his grandson Holger Eckarts 60 years later. Heinewitz begins the day in a Tobruk bunker inside the fortified position at Saint-Germain-de-Varville. In the early morning, they get bombarded by the heavy bombers and naval artillery. Heinewitz survives, but already now he is facing a Dante-esque scene of destruction. Everywhere the earth is pockmarked by impact craters. Behind his bunker, the bombs that have missed his position have hit the shed of a dairy herd, and the cows have been driven out into the field. It was a dreadful thing. These large cows with their full udders were injured, bleeding, and in some cases their hides were on fire. They were staggering or trampling in utter confusion. One began to charge towards me, obviously maddened. With its legs burning, I shot it immediately with the MG to prevent myself from being trampled. That was the first shot I fired on June 6th, ironically. On the other side of his bunker, an Allied Mustang has crashed. The fuselage stuck like a dart into the ground. The pilot is still alive, but the plane is on fire and soon explodes in a fiery red ball. Overhead, there were many more fighter aircrafts, all with the same black and white bands on the wings and fuselage, crossing north to south at low altitude. I could not see any Luftwaffe planes anywhere, which frankly was not a great surprise to me. The lack of Luftwaffe cover was an accepted fact by that stage, on all fronts, I believe. The position is soon under attack by U.S. paratroopers. Both sides take casualties. Heinewitz is wounded in the leg, and soon their position is impossible. He grabs his MG-34 machine gun and retreats inland together with 2 other German soldiers. Here he witnesses his first war crime, when the lieutenant he is with shoots and kills a forced laborer they encounter, just for insulting him. A bit further on, they find an abandoned half-track. They decide to use it for their continued retreat. But it doesn't take long for a Mustang to spot them. The Allied pilot opens fire on the vehicle, killing the driver and destroying the vehicle. On foot, they join other German soldiers also attempting to reach the relative safety of German positions further back from the coast. In a group of 20, they form a column down the road. The Allied planes soon return. Sometimes the planes fired on us, and at other times they simply flew along the road, firing at the empty pathway. They were at liberty to do as they pleased, with no Luftwaffe to challenge them at all. The strafing planes kill several in the group. There's no time to care for the dead and wounded. I remember that one man, one of the ROA, was hit in the abdomen by several bullets. His body was cut in half, I'm sorry to say, and the rest of us could only step over the 2 pieces as we ran on. They press on. Progress is slow, but in the late morning, after coming under friendly fire as well, they reach a fortified, well-armed position where a number of other men from the beaches have also regrouped. There is intelligence that a group of U.S. tanks are approaching, and they prepare for battle. Heinewitz is now on morphine and amphetamine, nuking the pain from his wound, and takes up position with his machine gun. It's now close to 11 a.m., and the reported tanks have not shown up. Once again, the Allies strike from the air. We heard a shouted warning, "Yabo! Fighter bomber!" I peered up through the concrete slit and saw a horizontal line of 3 aircraft descending on us over the marshes at great speed. These planes had very large radial engines, which from our recognition sessions I knew was distinctive of the Thunderbolt plane. I recall being surprised because the planes appeared to be bare metal. The sun reflected very brightly off their surfaces. In multiple waves, the Thunderbolts come down on them, unloading their bombs. The attack lasts only a couple of minutes. The flak gun in the position takes out one of the Thunderbolts, but soon the gun is hit and silenced. When the attack is over, Heinewitz emerges. The trench that had been hit was a horrible mess, with many dismembered bodies lying around it, many smoldering or contorted and blackened. I could hear flames and detonations from the other side of our bunker too. Then the shout went up, "Jabo again!" It seemed that the Americans had an endless stream of planes available, which were always arriving freshly armed on top of us. These new aircraft were also Thunderbolt types. However, as they approached, I saw the white streaks of light from under their wings and the descending lines of vapor, which showed they were using rockets. I had never seen rocket explosions close at hand before, and did not know what to expect. The Thunderbolts are firing white phosphor rockets. This decimates the bunker completely. Many of the men are killed, notably all the officers, including the lieutenant who murdered the forced laborer. Soon after, the US tanks arrive, as does a German Stug, and a brief battle begins. The Allies have the upper hand quickly, and Heinewetz again retreats, now together with a Stug crew. They pull back into a forest behind the bunkers, where eventually they manage to join a crew of Panzer Grenadiers. Shortly after noon, a platoon of 20 heavily armed, very young SS infantrymen joined them. The men are unwilling to move out of the protective woods, and for 2 hours they stay put, while Allied aircraft continue to crisscross over the sky above. About 3 p.m., they fear that the position is about to be outflanked and overrun, and the Panzergrenadier officers order them all to retreat to a line further south, which they have been ordered to hold at all costs. In a column of Stugs and other vehicles, they pull out along a route in the bocage. Here Heinewetz witnesses more evidence of war crimes, as above the road on a small ridge, he sees a row of dead US paratroopers still on their knees with bullet wounds to the back of their heads. Just as they pass the executed soldiers, 6 Thunderbolts come down flying along the narrow road, blocked both sides by hedgerows. The planes again fire rockets, this time with explosives. The American rockets poured along the column, many of the projectiles striking the field on the other side, and some striking short, exploding among the bodies of the American troops behind us. I saw these rockets were high explosive, which I had seen used in Italy, and I knew how destructive they could be. I saw the rockets devastate the American corpses, severing their limbs and their heads, and throwing the pieces for long distances across the fields, in trails of blood and smoking flesh. For this reason, I think the air attack destroyed the evidence of this execution, if that is indeed what they were. But other rockets came smashing directly into the German troops and vehicles in the sunken road. I held my hands over my head and looked through the gap between my helmet rim above my eyes and the ground under my chin as these weapons struck us. The entire column is completely blown apart. Most of the men are killed. Heinewetz keeps his head down in the shallow ditch. Part of me wanted to surrender and give up the fight, but another side of my mind said that to give up now was meaningless after so much effort when I was close to the next line of defense. In the end, I slid down into the sunken road and made my way along its length, intending to reach our next positions. A few other survivors were doing likewise, and we had to climb over the many shattered corpses in this roadway, with many severed limbs and heads strewn around among the burning vehicles. In some cases, the fallen men were still alive and panting or groaning miserably, and this sound was added to the crackle of the flames. Heinewetz makes it out, is patched together, and after 3 weeks of convalescence goes back into battle in July, when he is finally captured and sent to a POW camp in England.
Again, in the book D-Day Through German Eyes, compiled by Holger Eckertz, Heinewetz tells his story in his own words in far more detail than we can here. And it's only one of many eyewitness accounts in that book that give a rarely seen perspective of D-Day.
I can only recommend it. It's eye-opening in so many ways. What is also eye-opening is the lack of any greater number of German panzers on the battlefield today. Hitler has still not released the reserves, and many of the panzer units are far, far away getting ready to fight the ghost armies that the Allies have made the Germans believe will follow today's invasion. In this hour alone, Oberwest again makes another 3 calls to Berlin to request more armored support. I'll let their own words speak for themselves. It is certain that the enemy has deployed very considerable forces, and that in order to clear the breaches in the coastal defenses already achieved by his strong material superiority, apart from the first reserves, a deployment of the large command reserves is necessary. Obi West therefore requests again that the Panzer-Lehr division at least be allowed to advance into the area around Flers, since otherwise its intervention will become impossible even today. But Indy, how do things stand overall as we approach noon and the midpoint of D-Day?
You know, you mentioned the Panzer-Lehr division, right? But the Germans have a coastal panzer division, the 21st, that doesn't need to be released by Hitler. They've been ready since 2 o'clock in the morning. I can only assume that we will see them at some point. They were ordered out to the bridges, but then the order was changed to the beaches. But did they get one or both or neither of those orders? I don't know. And sure, bits and pieces of Hans von Luch's Grenadier Regiment of that division have been fighting the British airborne piecemeal, but nothing concentrated. But should the division concentrate, and should they be ordered to hit the bridges once and for all, and should they get there in force before any reinforcement armor can reach the bridges from the coast, well, I cannot see the hodgepodge of airborne battalions at the bridges fighting off an entire panzer division, and that would change the game completely. As for the beaches, well, what can I say? Things look promising at Utah at the moment. Men and machines are getting off the British beaches in force, though the enemy still controls some serious strong points. But Omaha is a real trouble zone, and the American airborne are scattered among the enemy. If that enemy gets it together just a bit more and focuses some mighty firepower on those causeways, all progress this morning will have been for naught. Make no mistake, this is a powerful enemy with powerful machines and weapons. Nothing is certain yet.